From Data to Dollars, the podcast series from Prosus. Hi there, and welcome to From Data to Dollars, a podcast series from Prosus about using AI in business. We hope that this show will help you navigate this exciting and fast-changing world as we explore conversations with leaders about how they've developed, deployed, and scaled AI in practice. Together we'll peer into the future of AI applications and what changes they could bring to the business world. I'm Paul Vanderboer, VP of Artificial Intelligence at Prosus. In this episode, we dive into the investor's perspective with a fascinating discussion featuring VCs from Redpoint, Sequoia, and our own Prosus Ventures. Today's podcast is a recording of a panel I hosted at the Prosus AI Marketplace, an event that we hosted with the MLOps community titled Agents in Production. Let's jump over to the conversation now.
All right, welcome everybody to stage one, track one of this exciting event, Agents in Production. My name is Paul. I am VP of AI at Prosus with our friends Sandeep, Mira, and George joining us from Prosus Ventures, Redpoint, and Sequoia. I'm very excited to have this conversation because I think collectively you probably have seen all the companies, AI companies out there doing something interesting on AI and agents. Maybe I ask you to do a quick introduction of yourself, what you're working on, maybe companies you've invested in that you're excited about, and then we can dive into the questions. Mira.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mira Clark. I am a Bay Area-based investor at Redpoint. Redpoint is a fund out here that's been around for 25 years, so a fairly long track record of investing across consumer, enterprise, infrastructure. And as we all know, all of these today touch AI. So think anyone from Mistral or Modal to a Poolside or Alea and everything in between. I sit within our early stage practice, so I look at seed and Series A companies primarily across software, but also touching a little bit of consumer land. It is hard to choose a favorite child or list too many children, and so I'll maybe mention the most recent deal I announced, which is in a Series A in a company called Prosus. Prosus is building an army of agents that streamline the administrative tasks across the construction industry. And so they are selling into many of the largest general contractors across the US and really saving them a lot of time and money across their day-to-day operations.
That's fantastic. I mean, a lot of those names, everybody I think watching will recognize, and some of us will be using a lot of the companies you mentioned. So we're going to have lots to talk about. Sandeep, so you want to follow with a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks, Paul. So I'm Sandeep. I look after European ventures and spend a little bit of my time in the US for Prosus. So given you moderating, I'm sure the audience will know who Prosus is based on this event. We are global investors. We invest across categories, across sectors, and between early and late stage. I spend most of my time focused on our early stage investment practice. And some of the more recent investments that we've done in the space that would be relevant for the audience are companies like Cordy in the healthcare space, Martian in the infrastructure space, and also Emma in the agent space. But yeah, very excited to be here.
Great. Thanks for joining. George.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm George. You can probably tell from my accent. I'm British, based in London. So we do everything from pre-seed to pre-IPO investing. We were early investors in companies like NVIDIA, Apple, Google, organizations that have gone on to be pretty seminal in obviously the AI space. Out of Europe, we're investing as one team from Israel to San Francisco. Companies we've invested in recently, a business like Anteria that focuses on automating claims management and prior authorization in the US healthcare market. I like it because they focus on the big problem of how to cut down these 100-page documents to something you can process in minutes, but also the small details of automating, calling a hospital to check on a missing detail in a form, kind of things like that. So big and small to unlock an opportunity.
Cool. As I mentioned, I think all of the AI companies that are doing anything interesting will have come by any of you, all of you, potentially. The theme of the conference is agents in production. So a lot of folks who are watching are working on, finding ways to put these agents into real systems and to create businesses and experiences around those. Could you maybe share what excites you about AI agents? What are the things that, are ready today for production that you're already seeing being part of products of businesses you've invested in, and things that are generally exciting for you for the next 12 months?
Historically, right, you think about Main Street, and these have been 9-to-5 businesses, but a lot of life happens kind of outside of that window. I think as we've moved online, expectations from consumers have really shifted to this always-on mentality of where is the web and shouldn't it be answering my questions? What I think is really interesting with these agents is this 24/7 support. that they're able to offer. We have companies in the portfolio that are answering phone calls, scheduling appointments, kind of across healthcare, kind of P&C insurance, you name it. And to me, that is really compelling. It's not this whole, scary, daunting labor replacement story that I think everyone is really excited to tell, but really this support. And I don't think there's any, customer success agent that wants to be online at 1 a.m. in the morning answering this nuanced question. And so I think the ability for these agents to come in and answer a lot of these or perform a lot of these more rote tasks, to us is really exciting because it leaves, I would say, the customer-facing roles to really do what they do best, which is deeply understand consumer pain points, build trust with them, help them more from like a navigation perspective. It's really bringing the hospitality aspect back to a lot of these industries. And so as we think about really enhancing the consumer experiences, whether that is in their dental office, down the street at the hardware store, or what have you, to me, that is really exciting because I think we talk a lot about tech making consumers' lives better, making people's lives better, both personally and professionally. But I think agents are really going a long way to streamline that as you think about kind of taking some of the work off of people's plates that they candidly don't want to be doing.
Just to build on some of the things that Mira said, that one of the areas that I found quite interesting, and Paul, here at Prosus, we spend a lot of time looking at some of the customer support type agents that exist. One of the things that I've been spending a little bit of time looking into is, as it pertains to customer support, the concept of agent is not new. Generally speaking, I mean, the concept of typing into somebody and trying to interact with somebody on the other side is not new. And for me as a customer, if I take an example of a travel booking and I'm dealing with an online agent, I know that I'm dealing with an online agent. So all I try and do is prompt them in ways to try and get to a human, even if it may be 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. at some place elsewhere. And what I'm actually interested in spending time on is how to reshift the customer's perception. So in that case, for me to understand that actually, if I prompt the agent better, I will actually get more help versus I don't need to try and find the quickest hack to redirect myself to a human. And that's actually an area where I've been spending a little bit of time because changing consumer behaviors is incredibly difficult. And what tools exist out there as people are building, especially as these models get more powerful, that can change customer behavior, where we're used to trying to just get a human on the phone as quick as possible.
Maybe just to pick up a final piece here. I think, what ties all that together is this idea that you reduce the marginal cost to deliver some service. I think there are plenty of examples of industries which have been very resistant to digitization, places where I think we would have assumed maybe in the marketplace era, marketplaces might emerge in both consumer actually and in B2B context. I think we're seeing this phenomenon of like zero cost bids, a little bit to Mira's point of being able to go out 24/7. There are so many industries that are heavily brokered, that disintermediated by a bunch of these different partners. In today's world, you can actually use agents to go out and get quotes from millions of these different people 24/7 in many languages to build together a lot of the component parts that look like a marketplace experience to digitize a bunch of those supply chains for the first time. And that's the first opportunity we've seen really to unlock that, from the heydays of B2B marketplaces to now.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think one of the things that caught my attention is multiple agents working together. I think, Mira, you alluded to it as a swarm of agents. And can you sort of share, what you've seen in the companies you've spoken to or you've invested in, the one that you mentioned that actually uses this in production? How does that work? What's the experience to the users of that particular product?
First, you have to address the why there are multiple versus kind of one. And I think that comes down to two primary dynamics. One is agent capabilities, which are good today. They're not perfect. And so it's kind of thinking about, can you build a better model if it is more specialized or with greater guardrails around it in terms of the tasks it's being asked. I think equally as importantly, though, is that human psychology perspective. I think to some deep comments on kind of our nature to prompt and prompt and prompt till we get a human. Similarly, as you think about agents becoming these new employees, if you will. And it's interesting, we talk to a lot of the customers, they have named these agents and they are talking about Sally, they are talking about Annie, and Sally does a different job than Annie at the office. But in their mind, they don't have employees, right, that both, check someone dies and file the bills and then sell you the glasses or what have you. These are independent workers. And so I think some of what we're seeing is candidly just a reaction to how humans work and agents taking this gradual progression of inserting themselves into the way that work gets done in a way that isn't overly disruptive for the consumers. In terms of what that means with these companies, I think a lot of it also comes down to this almost element of AI overwhelming them. And this idea of, okay, if I open a ChatGPT window or a Gemini window, I can ask this thing anything and everything, and I don't know where to start. By starting with these individual agents, companies can say, let's take a general contractor, for example. I just want an agent to answer my questions surrounding the specs in this room. I just want an agent that's going to update scheduling. And so you can roll these out kind of sequentially versus overwhelming someone with you have every tool in the world at your fingertips. Good luck using it. Because again, I think where we're seeing AI penetration today in a really impressive and meaningful way is in a lot of these industries that have been fairly underpenetrated by tech historically. And so the willingness to change or the eagerness to adopt is just quite different than if you're selling into a developer sitting in San Francisco or London or New York.
I think you put it beautifully. I think this idea of finding the right form factor for it to start to be activated in companies, I think is critical. I think the nice thing is for a lot of those processes, playbooks exist that, as you said, humans already follow day to day. And I think you can start with something that is relatively granular. But I think what's really interesting is you're starting to see agents having quite sophisticated fallbacks. Right? We have instances now where a company like Expo in our portfolio that focuses on automating pen testing. Right? Pen testing is in some ways kind of an iterative exercise. You do it typically, pretty infrequently as a company because it's expensive, it's quite services driven. Now you can start to change the relationship you have with that kind of service provider if you're using something like an agent. And to run that process, you obviously need to continue to try different approaches on the same infrastructure over time as different threat vectors evolve. And it just changes the way you think about consuming that end service.
The only thing that I would add, again, building on something Mira said, is that what exists today isn't perfect. And the question of what level of perfection or how accurate do we need to have? As you have, maybe one that's 90% and the second that's 70% and the third that's 60%, what level of accuracy? And I think it's predicated upon what industry you're servicing and where you have the ability to accept a lower level of accuracy. So I think that's one thing that we're spending a lot of time trying to think about, the cost of inaccuracy and inaccuracy relative to what already exists in an industry.
When you speak to founders that are building companies around this next generation of generative AI and in particular agentic systems, there's a lot, when we build agent systems at Prosus, a lot of that is, at this moment, like you said, it's early stages, trying to sort of get it to work a first time, then measure if you're at the 60% mark or the 99th% mark. Because we do see that there's a path to getting there. In some cases, it'll be an expensive and long road. In other cases, just a matter of, months and we'll get there and integrations and making engineering work. When you speak to founders and teams that, are working on these kinds of promises, what are the things you look out for to assess whether you think this is the right team you want to be partnering with from an investment point of view?
I mean, there are some warnings maybe from some previous, incredible technologies like autonomous vehicles, where I think there was an assumption that the performance criteria was as good as humans. And it's broadly been at that level of performance for a while, but it turns out it's kind of humans plus risk appetite, plus regulation, plus a bunch of different barriers. And we've seen over the last 15 years, incredible work, but huge amounts of investment. And obviously we're still yet to see, autonomous vehicles outside of San Francisco, on our roads. I think when we spend time assessing that opportunity, speaking to customers is critical, right? In some ways, that matters the same as for any founder in any company, understanding the voice of your customer. But here it matters because you're dealing with, an existing process typically, in many cases, that has some kind of performance expectation. That might be accuracy, precision. It might also be cost, right? So the benchmarks are typically quite easy to understand. There is some level of innovation budget that will come from a lot of companies in today's world towards exploring opportunities around that will take you so far. And I think in some ways, a lot of companies that have been successful have found a clever way to access those budgets very, very quickly to be able to get early validation in a particular deployment. I think the really crucial thing is actually to speak to people that are building the foundational infrastructure, because for some of these iterations of these models, the performance might not be sufficient. In some ways, history has shown us it takes exponentially longer and is exponentially more expensive for every incremental percentage point of performance you eke out. And in some cases, that means we might be able to get there and we're 6 months out, 18 months out. And in some cases, it might be years, right? And the timing you have as an early stage company, that really matters.
One of the things that we've seen, at least as it pertains to companies that are servicing the enterprise, is early stage companies, early-ish stage companies that will work with enterprises as design partners and kind of tapping into that innovation budget. And then there will be companies that sign up customers and they'll go through their entire procurement process, which will typically be around, varies for every organization, we'll just call it 100K type ACV. And once you go through those processes, they've really been tried and tested to ensure that it fits regulation, compliance. Is there a clear need? Because large enterprises, it's very complex. a company to go through a large organization's procurement process. So we will take for earlier stage companies, we'll take some validation through companies that have gone through that.
You mentioned, George, that, getting up that sort of accuracy curve and sort of getting to the required threshold is if it's 90% or 95% accuracy. There's been some noise recently on the fact that we may be plateauing in terms of performance of some of these models, where some of the big labs are allegedly seeing a sort of diminishing returns on investment in getting these models to the required accuracy levels to get them to execute the tasks with a certain amount of improvement, right? Reasoning capabilities, planning, and so on. Is that something that you are in any way seeing or noticing or paying attention to? Or is there sufficient runway, let's say, on the existing capabilities that we already have out there today with existing models to build on top of, and you're not necessarily dependent on the success of, let's say, the next generation of models to get those businesses to become viable?
I think it's a wonderful question. There's so many moving pieces as part of that ecosystem, right? You have obviously the performance of the base models and how they've been evolving. You have this incredible proliferation of open source models. You have multimodality showing up in ways that are quite unexpected. I mean, who would have thought that actually some of the biggest improvements you see in computer vision deployed in industrial manufacturing actually come from prompt engineering, right? And LLMs being overlaid on top of traditional vision models. That's something that I definitely didn't foresee. And it's something we hear from a lot of our founders being that kind of surprising expected performance uplift. Second thing, though, is all the tooling and like the data pipelines around it just continue to improve immeasurably. So the ability for a wider pool of people who are potentially less specialized in one particular domain to have more strength to wrangle the performance of some underlying model has just improved exponentially over the last 18 months. So I think if you look at, the base model performance is one thing, but all of that ecosystem of tooling around it means we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, maybe to double click on that, I think the data point is a particularly important one. I think it's easy to look at certain sectors where you say OpenAI as about as good of performance as anyone else because they have access to all the data. There are many industries out there, right, where this data is not publicly available. And so kind of the larger model providers haven't been able to train on it. I think healthcare is a very obvious one. Construction is a very obvious one. But there are quite a few others. And so if we sort of think about the industries that we're going after, those are particularly interesting for us because I think that's where you still can drive a pretty meaningful delta by getting more data kind of into the system and to train on.
The statement was made, well, if you just stop all technology development today, we still have 15 years of technological dividend to build viable businesses on top of. Would you agree with that? And the businesses you're talking to, the founders, the things that they're proposing, to what extent are they dependent on future breakthroughs versus they're actually taking what we already have and just building businesses on top of that? Because the truth is that the rate of acceleration in the last couple of years has been so high that it also takes time to build a business proposition and a product on top of that. So you could take the position, well, we don't need more technology breakthroughs to continue for at least, 15 years is a long time, but let's say 5 to 10 years and build entirely new propositions around that. Would you agree?
Performance improvement aside, I think there's a question of when do these business models shift to being long-term viable? And given the cost structure today, many, if not most of them, are not. So that concerns me.
For us, there are definitely those businesses that currently have an incredibly high cost base, or the unit economics don't quite make sense. So they're predicated upon models becoming cheaper. That being said, I think for some of the businesses that we've seen or we have invested in, particularly those, to Mira's earlier point, that have been built on top of their own proprietary data, those have the ability to continue to accelerate, especially because there's so much friction to get into some of those industries. So there continues to be an opportunity to penetrate into that market. But it's definitely an interesting debate because currently, to Tamira's point, there's just a lot of things that are prohibitively expensive. So I'm glad I'm not a fortune teller.
And maybe just to pull, I guess, a slightly different thread, AI doesn't give you distribution, right? It might give you an incredible value prop that allows you to have some wedge into some large market opportunity. But broadly, you still need to keep pushing, right? If you want to build a platform and to kind of endure in the long run. And I think it really matters depending on the dynamics of your market. You come up against, in some cases, legacy incumbents who are incredibly unautomated, in some cases, pretty poorly digitized. And that's just ripe for automation and disruption from a company. I think you also need to think about, who are you really competing against? And are there sort of next generation players that are 2018, 2020 vintage companies with high product velocity and already pretty widespread distribution? And thinking about the right strategy to take on a business like that is very different from like a 1980s, legacy incumbent.
Just to build on the economics piece, we recently looked at the cost per token generated over the last 2 years, right? So we've been building in the space for several years now, and looked at what the drop had been. And so we took the baseline of the most powerful model exactly 2 years ago, November 2022, which was GPT-3 Da Vinci, and it cost $20 per million tokens to generate tokens. And now that has dropped, the equivalent model in terms of performance, the closest GPT-4o, which costs 0.24 cents for that same amount of million tokens. So you're talking about a 2 order of magnitude drop, 98% drop in about 2 years. At the same time, as we build our own agents, obviously, we're testing and experimenting with a lot of stuff inside Prosus. We've been looking at the costs over the last couple of months per question that our agents are answering. And while you see a tremendous drop in the actual cost per token, because we're building agentic systems, they are calling the models many more times. They're requiring many more tokens that per token are more expensive as well. And so actually the cost per question that we're answering went up, right? About 25%, right? So it's not a 2 orders of magnitude increase, but it's sort of an interesting and very hard to budget for world, because on the one hand, the costs come down per token, but you're requiring more tokens to do things, especially in an agentic future. And so as we talk about agents in production, getting that sort of to become viable is hard and definitely hard to predict. But maybe to build on that idea, do you see a fundamental shift in the underlying business models? Because when they are predicated on calling large language models, the marginal cost to create value, to have an interaction with the user, to drive engagement is not zero, right? So the volume of engagement is directly correlated with the cost, because every time you have a user interacting with your product, you're obviously paying for those tokens in some way. Do you see the economics changing of the businesses you invest in? Are these variable marginal costs indeed now scaling or harder to scale on top of? Are the sort of gross margins changing for businesses that try and scale? How do you think about that?
Happy to start. I mean, in many cases, these companies with these very ambitious founders are chasing huge prizes. And we touched on it a little bit earlier, but like if you have an incumbent like Salesforce, right, the best place to take on a business like Salesforce isn't probably to price like Salesforce, deliver a product that looks and sounds like Salesforce. It's probably to think about, an incumbent like that has a business built on recurring revenue, right? Independent of usage in some ways. I mean, yes, seat-based, but independent of usage. The opportunity in a lot of these go-to-market tools now is selling outcomes, right? Not necessarily selling a system of record, but really a system of engagement that has completely different economics for you as a business when you use it. Because again, you're getting much more return on investment on the human labor because of these very high levels of automation. I think if you can get to that level of alignment, I mean, you have a different take rate, right? If you think about the percentage of revenue that you're able to sort of claim, if you can get to something that is outcome-based, we see kind of 15 to 20%-ish almost of the net revenue you're generating, but it's much lower in the funnel, right? Because you're basically taking accountability for being able to do that. So I think actually going with an outcome like that, which is quite novel and really shakes up the industry, in which your incumbent will not be able to follow you because in many cases they're a public company, they're tied to those expectations, the like. I think that really allows you to create some noise in your market. And crucially, if you're aligning your cost base with that, it provides some scalability as well.
It also, to some extent, depends on your competition. So we have a portfolio company called Superside, which provides creative services to marketing teams. And historically speaking, their competition were advertising agencies. And advertising agencies, they traditionally operate at, 20, 30% gross margins, right? 40% gross. These are high services businesses. Now you have a lot of these design tools that have allowed people to iterate and create thousands of ideas in a short amount of time together with creative professionals. But instead of having, 4 individuals, you can do it with 1 individual and still have the same output, the same outcome, to use George's word. And when you look at those comparisons, it doesn't matter how many tokens, the relative benchmark is very different, because the competition or the expectation of how much you would pay is also very different. Now, how does that change over time as your customers become more attuned to the fact that, their mind shift based on what pricing should look like? That we'll see. But I think at the moment, we're still in with the initial innings of trying, using, testing, paying for some of these tools, that I think that the competition is more so with the incumbent, and therefore higher willingness to try and to pay for it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think in general, regardless of, let's say, where the take rate comes from and the structure of the business, the unit of intelligence is going to get cheaper and will trend to zero. So at some point, it maybe just be a matter of time until it becomes viable for the businesses that are building on top of these things. Would you regard startups building AI agents as SaaS companies or as infrastructure companies?
Maybe just looking at Redpoint anecdotally as a fund, we historically had, call it majors and minors as investors, and some of us would look at consumer, some would look at SaaS, some would look at infrastructure. I would say over the past, call it 12 to 18 months, that model has entirely been blown off. And traditionally, consumer investors are looking at infrastructure because it's infrastructure, API businesses, and consumer experiences. You're looking at infrastructure investors looking at, a lot of these consumer companies because they come with a network as it relates to kind of the researchers that are building them. And so I think you were seeing at many funds, maybe not all funds, with this reversion to more of this like generalist mindset. Again, coming with opinions or subject matter expertise in specific domains or across specific themes in terms of taking a point of view on where the world is headed. But I feel like the business model itself is something that investors today are a little bit less focused on, at least from my vantage point.
I think from our perspective, it's who is your end customer and how used to buying software are they? What budget are you tapping into? What's their alternative? So if you're selling something to developers that were typically speaking used to buying software, used to buying products like this, versus selling to something to somebody in the construction industry, to use the Trump tools example, those are very, very different. And those have very different sales motions, or to use George's comment earlier, have very different distribution mechanisms. So that's kind of how we try and think about this. How are you acquiring these customers? What budgets are you tapping into versus trying to use a SaaS or an infrastructure type moniker to it?
Since we've been talking about predictions and the way the world's going to look in a year, maybe we can do a closing round or a wild prediction that you may want to share about the future of AI companies and the AI industry to keep an eye on for the next 12 months.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I come from a fintech background. There's a big problem statement like the last 15 years has been designed around two-factor authentication and thinking about protecting people from having their card details stolen by people making payments without their consent. Really, in the future, it's inevitable that we'll have agents paying agents. We'll have agents paying humans, probably to procure work from more complex workflows. And we need to find the right structure, the right infrastructure, but also the right regulation to enable that.
I think we are very excited and intrigued by how the atomic unit of interaction will evolve. Today, much of our back and forth with these agents are through chatbots. I think we're seeing a lot of voice popping up, but whether it is avatars, infinite canvases, or something else entirely, I think we're seeing a lot of experimentation, and we are very excited to see, how those interactions will change over the coming quarters.
From an e-commerce perspective, you're looking at the future of e-commerce and shopping and looking at the next wave of personal shopping assistants and personal digital assistants. I anticipate that will come. It probably won't be. I think it was Bill Gates that commented that whoever creates the personal assistant will build the next $1 trillion company. But I don't know if it's going to be that far, at least in the time horizon that I have in my mind. But I think that personalized, very, very attentive shopping assistance is something that could come in the near future.
So there you go. It's clear that AI agents are the next act in generative AI, and we knew that. But still, I found it quite fascinating to hear that investors like Mira, George, and Sandeep are seeing even some of the earliest opportunities for agents already taking place in under-digitized industries like construction and healthcare. Now that's it for this episode. You've been listening to From Data to Dollars. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'll be back soon with more episodes. Bye for now.